and Emily on this amazing symposium for the second year running. Have a look around the room. If anyone ever doubts the strength of feeling towards Israel by young American Jewry, they should look around this room, because it's really sensational to see you all coming for this event. We are also joined, by the way, by a global audience online, I believe from Boston, from Florida, from Chicago, from all across the US, waking up early on a Sunday to be with us today. So we welcome them, and we welcome their questions as well towards the end of the panel. So, on to Zionism. Often a confused concept, right? I mean, how many isms are very popular nowadays? There aren't that many, right? Think about it. Racism, sexism, vegetarianism, they aren't so popular. But Zionism is something that has touched all of our lives, I believe, in some way. Feminism. And yet, yes, well, feminism is a good one. We'll go with feminism. We like that. Okay. So Zionism is something that has touched all of our lives, and yet it's something we're constantly analysing and trying to get to the bottom of the concept. Well, joining us this evening are three amazing luminaries who are going to help us get to the bottom of that amazing concept. A Google of the word Zionism brings up some worrying entries. A little earlier I found what Zionism is and its pernicious influence on the USA. That was in the top 10. True Torah Jews against Zionism. We had the Jews Not Zionist Race website. We had Zionism against Jews. Don't know how that works, but that was there as well. We had the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. That's a new one. And Jew Watch. So we're being watched at least. So this is in the top 10 of Google entries when you try and find something out about Zionism. So what is it? What have the challenges of the last 100 years been for Zionism? And going forward, how can we define and predict what are the future challenges of Zionism going to be? Joining us this evening are three fantastic speakers who I'm going to give just 7 minutes to try and outline what the challenges of Zionism have been and successes of Zionism have been in the last 100 years. What we'll then do is go around the table and see what their visions are for the future of Zionism. We're also going to be joined by three respondents from the audience here, who throughout this panel are going to be putting together their thoughts and telling us about them at the end. And of course we'll be taking questions from you and from the global audience. So, if you are all ready, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Einat Wilf, MK, is a member of Israel's Knesset and chair of the Independence faction. She serves on the Foreign Affairs and Defense, Education and Finance committees. Previously, Dr. Wilf served as a senior fellow with the Jewish People Policy Planning Institute, a foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and a strategic consultant with McKinsey and Company. Dr. Wilf served as an intelligence officer in the Israel Defense Forces and holds a BA in Government and Fine Arts from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Cambridge. She's also the author of 2 books, and she will be very pleased to address an audience which, unlike in the Knesset, were not interrupted during the middle. Please welcome MK Dr. Einat Wilf.
Sorry, I didn't realize that we were going there. Well, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Is this working? No? Is that pressing anything? Yes. The on button. Okay, so I want to start just about a couple years ago. I was invited by AIPAC to address at a breakfast a senior delegation of members, Democratic members of Congress from the United States, headed by their chair. And I was asked to give a talk about the history of Zionism. Now, I looked at it as a very straightforward mission. I explained Zionism without thinking that I'm on a mission to do something about it. I explained Zionism the way I was taught it, the way I saw it, a movement of national liberation, the assumption of responsibility by the Jewish people, the remarkable idea that was followed by young people from around the world to create the country, the utopian visions that were associated with it, and so forth. At the end of the talk, the head of the delegation, a senior member of Democratic Congress, asks me the question. He says, the way you describe Zionism, it sounds very nice. Why does it have such a bad reputation? And in a way, that was a very shocking question to me, that someone would find it odd that what I viewed as a very straightforward description of the history of Zionism would be considered in a way so jarring to people who have been accustomed to, as you described it from Google, to have it associated with all that is evil in our world, all the values that we reject. So, first of all, we really need to acknowledge that there is a fundamental problem that what Zionism is, before we need to reimagine it and refresh it and rethink it, what Zionism is good. And the fact that itself is not the case today, that is a battle that has to be fought even before we talk about reimagining Zionism for the future. I want to discuss, though, why I think there is a certain crisis or a crisis of misunderstanding of Zionism, and why many people consider it irrelevant for our today's world. The reason is, because Zionism was a movement of national liberation, it required, unlike other movements of national liberation, it required the two things that all other movements had. It required what all other national liberation movements had to begin with: land and people. Zionism is unique among national liberation movements that it had to create the two. It had to create the land and it had to create the people. Literally get the people to the land and purchase the land, acquire it, settle it, and ultimately fight for it. So the ideas that have to do with land and people have become, for the first 50, 60, I would say even 100 years of Zionism, they became the defining ideas of Zionism, and over time we began to confuse them with Zionism. Aliyah, settling the land, serving in the military, so fighting to defend the land. All of the things that were associated with bringing people and land so that national sovereignty and national liberation would be possible, we identify them as the essence of the national liberation movement. Now, this phase is clearly over. The phase of Aliyah is over in the sense that there are no more plane loads of Jews to rescue in the middle of the night and bring to Israel. If people make Aliyah now to Israel, they do so on an individual basis. Israel today is home to the largest and pretty much the only growing Jewish community. So in terms of getting the people here, we could say we're pretty much done. We're there. We could always do a little more, but check mark on that. In terms of the land, we bought it. We got it by United Nations mandate, then we settled it, we fought for it, we acquired it, we conquered it. If anything, right now Israel is in the process of receding from some of that land. So even though that is one of the most contentious issues, still the question of the acquisition of more land so that the Jews can have a place where they are sovereign, that is over as well. Because these two things are over, there is a sense of crisis that Zionism is over. But these were not Zionism, and they were never the essence of Zionism. They were merely the basis from which Zionism could begin to operate. And ultimately, Zionism was always about the utopian ideals that came with it, about the fact that the renewal of sovereignty of the Jewish people would mean something remarkable for the world at large, but also for the Jewish, and specifically for the Jewish people themselves. And in many ways, we should celebrate the fact that the questions of people and land are no longer at the center of the question of Zionism, and now we finally have the space and the opportunity to reflect on Zionism in its essence. What does it mean to be sovereign? What does it mean to have national sovereignty? What does it mean to have moved from a people whose institutions were built over centuries and millennia for non-sovereign existence into a sovereign existence? Now, I have some pretty radical ideas about what that should mean, but maybe that will be for the second part.
Sounds good to me.
Absolutely. So this is, in short, why I think there is a misunderstanding on the crisis of where we are today. And I think rather than a misunderstanding of the crisis, this is an opportunity to truly begin to cut to the core of what Zionism was always meant to be about. Thank you.
Thank you. Backed by popular demand, Yossi Klein Halevi is a fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and a contributing editor to the New Republic. He's a commentator on Israeli affairs, and his op-eds appear in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Jerusalem Report, and other publications. He's author of At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, A Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land, and he's currently writing a book about the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem in 1967. Please welcome Yossi Klein Halevi.
Thank you, and Laurie and Yoav, it's wonderful to be with you here. In order to assess the historic achievement of Zionism, I'd like to take us back to the state of the Jewish people in 1945. Now, these days, when I speak to a general audience, a non-Jewish audience, I try to avoid the Shoah as much as possible, because the Shoah is now being used against us in ways that I think many of you know. And for example, when President Obama spoke in Cairo and he was looking for a way of trying to explain the legitimacy of Israel and Zionism to the Muslim world, he unfortunately invoked the Shoah rather than the indigenousness of the Jewish people. So I think we need to be very careful in a more general setting to separate as much as possible the legitimacy of Israel and Zionism from the Shoah. But in our own internal conversation, I would argue that we need to deepen our understanding of our narrative, our modern narrative, and what has happened to the Jewish people in the last 70 years. And so, 1945. The Shoah essentially assaulted the Jewish people in three potentially fatal ways: physical, psychological, and spiritual. The physical assault on the Jewish people, of course, was the destruction of the heartland of the Jewish people. Jews of Eastern Europe were in the 20th century, the early 20th century, the repository of world Jewish creativity. What was happening to Jews in the West was a situation of deep lack of self-confidence. Jews in the Soviet Union were being subjected to enforced assimilation, and the ancient Jewish communities of the Middle East were on the verge of decolonization and an experience of shattering. So the loss of the Jewish heartland in Eastern Europe was potentially fatal for the Jewish people. Second, the psychological assault. In the months and years after the Shoah, it was widespread among Jews, certainly Jews outside of Europe, to speak disparagingly of the Jews of Europe as having gone like sheep to slaughter. Today, we have a much more sophisticated understanding of the nature of the resistance of the Jews during the war. But in the immediate aftermath of the Shoah, there was a deep sense of shame, that there had to be something wrong with this people that had allowed itself to be such perfect victims. And I would argue that there was also a deep sense of shame in the diaspora that had not been affected by the Shoah directly, specifically among American Jews who had failed to mount a credible rescue attempt, and to some extent in the Yishuv, in pre-state Jewish community here as well. I remember growing up with books in the 1960s in the United States with titles like Jews Fight Too. We needed to prove to ourselves somehow that we were worthy. And the final assault was spiritual, an assault on the God of history, which is, in some sense, the essence of the Jewish understanding of our relationship with God. This is not a hidden God. It is a God that is actively involved in the fate of the world and certainly in the fate of the Jewish people. And the Holocaust threatened to be the most powerful and mythic event in Jewish history, which would have left its imprint on the spiritual self-understanding of the Jewish people and in our understanding of a fatally weakened God of Israel. The Zionist response, whether consciously, in some senses consciously, in some senses not, was to reverse all three of these assaults. In terms of physical destruction, the reconstitution of the Jewish people, the physical ingathering of the Jewish people. In terms of psychological insecurity, we no longer, needless to say, have to publish books with titles like Jews Fight Too. If anything, the perception in the world today is that Jews fight too well. And finally, the reclamation of the God of Israel, in the sense that the creation of Israel created a mythic counterweight to the Shoah. It's not that it delivered a spiritual knockout blow to the Shoah. It's not that Israel, in some sense, explains the Shoah. But Israel made it possible for many Jews to think again in terms of the God who loves and protects the people of Israel. That was hardly the goal of the secular founders of the state. Nevertheless, it was an unintended and very profound consequence that we are living out very strongly in our time. Okay. In terms of the failures, first of all, we have failed to create a common sense of Israeliness with over 20% of our citizens who are not Jewish, who are outside of the very powerful mythic nature of the Zionist success story. And we have failed to figure out a way of balancing our Jewishness with our Israeliness, of creating, I would say, a neutral public space, a civic public space that is not directly linked with the Jewish experience. The second deep failure, which we are finally and belatedly beginning to confront now, is that Zionism freed the Jewish people, but it kept Judaism in the ghetto. For all kinds of historic, political, sociological reasons, the form of Judaism that took official and exclusive root here was, in some sense, the most ghettoized form of Judaism. So that the face of Judaism in the sovereign state of Israel is pre-sovereign. And the great challenge for this generation, the great spiritual challenge, is to free Judaism from the ghetto and to begin to take responsibility for what sovereign forms of Judaism in the next phase of Jewish history might look like. And the final challenge, related to the two above that I've just laid out, is that we have two communities that are, for all practical purposes, outside of our national identity, and they happen to be the two fastest growing communities. I'm speaking of the Haredim and the Arab Israelis. These two communities must in some way be integrated into the national identity, and just to give you an idea of how difficult that is, for the Arab Israelis, the great obstacle to Israeli identity is the Jewish nature of our public space. For the ultra-Orthodox, the great obstacle is that our public space is perceived as not being Jewish enough. How we bring these two groups into Israeliness is one of the great challenges of our time.
Thank you very much, Yossi. Next to address the achievements and challenges of Zionism over the last 100 years, Dr. Tal Becker is a fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and international associate at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. From 2006 to 2009, he served as senior policy advisor at Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was a lead negotiator in Israeli-Palestinian negotiators during the Annapolis peace process. He's represented Israel in a wide variety of bilateral and multilateral negotiations and served as director of the International Law Department at the Israeli Foreign Ministry, counsel to Israel's UN mission in New York, and international law expert in the Military Advocate General's Corps of the Israel Defense Forces. Dr. Becker, postdoctorate from Columbia. His book, Terrorism and the State, Rethinking the Rules of State Responsibility, is the recipient of the 2007 Guggenheim Prize for Best International Law Book. We're thrilled to have him with us. Please welcome Dr. Tal Becker.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to be with the Schaefer family, and in a way, real inspiration to be here too, so I thank you for the opportunity. 7 minutes, so let's go. My daughter Shira is 10 years old, and in my garden, I live in Arnona near the Tayelet, for those of you who have been there and seen the view. And I have a garden, and if you kind of tilt your head to the very side and look through the corner between some houses, you can actually see the Temple Mount. And we were lying in a hammock at precisely that point in the garden, and I asked her what she had been studying at school. And she said she had been studying Akedat Yitzchak, the Binding of Isaac. I thought to myself, 10 years old, Binding of Isaac, not sure I would have made that choice, but that's okay. And I asked her, do you know where the Binding of Isaac took place? And she looks at me like I'm a total idiot. She, just absolute disdain. And she goes, yeah, there. And she just points with her finger to Har HaBayit through the gap in the other apartments around us. And I had this shiver going through my spine when she did that, because I thought, my grandparents from Warsaw, my grandfather had 4 sisters, my grandmother had 12 brothers and sisters, all of them murdered in the Holocaust. They were the only survivors. And here their great-grandchild is pointing to the Temple Mount and looking at her father like he's an idiot, because he doesn't know that that's where it happened, and that's why he's asking her. And I really had this sense of what an absolute miracle the Zionist story is. That a people 3,500 years old are able, through all its trials and tribulations, to come back and realize their rights to self-determination. But I guess what bothered me a little bit was, even though it's an incredible miracle for me, I'm not sure it's such a miracle for her. She kind of thought that I was a basic idiot. It's pretty much taken for granted. And then I thought, it's not even a miracle for me all the time. And most of the time, I'm actually feeling pretty conflicted about it myself. And I started to think, for all the amazing achievements, and they really are historic, I don't think they have a parallel in terms of our ability to realize our sovereignty in our ancient homeland. How come I don't feel that in Australia we say crash hot about it anymore? How come I don't feel so good about it most of the time? How come the propaganda doesn't work on me? Right? I actually have been involved sometimes in drafting it in the earlier stages of my career. I look at that stuff now and I think, oh, my daughter's right, I really am an idiot. How come so often I open the newspaper and I get depressed? I feel pessimistic. And I sometimes feel like what's happening in the Israeli debate and in different parties in Israel trying to achieve power in Israel is who is going to be in power in order to manage the erosion of this wonderful idea. What is the pace that the erosion is going to take place? When I wake up in the morning, I don't know if you have the same feeling, but when I read a story about Hadarat Nashim, or what happened recently about the exclusion of women from the public space, or acts of discrimination and so on and so forth. A whole bunch of different stories I could tell. The wind is taken out of my sails. And it's not because I don't know how to defend Israel in the public audience. I know how to make the talking points. I know how to compare Israel to other countries. I actually just don't care about that stuff. I'm not interested in whether we're better than France or Syria or Turkey. I don't care. I care if the listener, the audience, it's my job to make them care. But what I care is the society that I live in. And I wanted to mention briefly 4 things that occur to me why, if any of you share this feeling, why it's sometimes hard just to be happy about this miracle. I think the first is that even though, in a sense, and Yoav said this beautifully, I thought, in a sense, Zionism has achieved its objective. It established a state for the Jewish people in its homeland. You read, it's one of the few political platforms that have ever achieved their objective as far as I remember. You read the 1897 Basel Convention, word for word, I think we did it. The problem, I think, is for so many of us, the crisis remains. We still feel like we're battling for our survival. So much so that when you listen to the way we talk, and I'll say something a little bit controversial, it sometimes sounds like Israel is the biggest diaspora community in the world. Because it seems to be the one where the most serious focus on how precarious our existence is takes place. Everything is temporary. We use the word existential threat, according to my estimates, about every 3 seconds. It's almost as if, I wrote this recently, it's almost as if we've defined Israel as the place where we created Israel so that we could concentrate Jewish anxiety in one location. And those threats are real, and they tire us out. They're tiring, because every morning you wake up and you see them and you hear them. You can be naive and dismiss them, but that is naive. But it still makes you feel like, well, if we achieved it, why is it still such hard work? The second thing I would say is that to some extent in the battle in Zionism between the political Zionists, for those who know, who particularly, that there's a lot more nuance in this than I'm giving credit to, created Israel as a place of refuge. And those who are more like a Chada'am, who saw it as a spiritual center, in essence partly because of the Shoah, things that Yossi mentioned, the political Zionists kind of set the tone. We earned the right to be normal. But being normal is boring. Being normal is boring. And sometimes we don't even do the normal all that well. We have a system of government where a prime minister looks around his cabinet table, and I'm not talking about this particular government, just to be clear, any government. The prime minister looks around the table and he's not sure whether about 50% of the people, about 50% of the time, are thinking about how to ensure that he fails. It's very hard to run a country like that, even normally. The third area, which I think makes this a miraculous achievement still feel a little bit weighed down for us, is that I think we've got the Jewish part of this state pretty wrong. We've got it very shallow. We understand our Jewishness essentially to go around this idea. We have a Jewish majority, we have a state that can protect the Jewish people, we have Jewish public symbols, Shabbat, menorah, and so on. Those are all very important things. But if that's the be-all and end-all of being a Jewish state, what am I here for? And the fourth thing, just to mention briefly, kind of ties all these things together, I think. And that is the idea of what our aspiration is. If you connected to the guiding narrative of the Zionist movement, I think, of the establishment of the state, which was political Zionism, then the great achievement of Zionism was the establishment of the state. That means the job of every generation after that is to protect what we achieved before. We are Dor HaNoflim, the fallen generation. We look back to our founding fathers in awe, and we say, well, they did the really cool thing, they established the state, and our job is to wake up every morning and ask, who is threatening it? How do you get people, young people in particular, how do I get Shira my daughter, my 10-year-old, for that to be the driving force in her life. A people are as great as their next aspiration. A country, a state is as great as its next aspiration. And a movement like the Zionist movement is as great as its next aspiration. And unless we articulate that much better than we have so far, that pace of erosion, I think, will continue. And I'm going to have a harder time convincing Shira to have a shiver down her spine. Thank you.
Thank you, Tal. Okay, so we've looked back in various different ways, historically, psychologically, and now it's time to look forward. I'm going to ask our panelists if they can give us, in a very, very short amount of time, but that was short just now, their analysis of the what will define Zionism in the next, let's just say 50 years. That's good enough, 50 years. Okay. What's going to inspire us? What is going to be the next great inspiration for all of us in the next decades, as far as Zionism is concerned? Dr. Wilf.
Thank you. You know, Tal, I was thinking about your list of why you're perpetually unhappy and dissatisfied, and I think that the main reason is that you're Jewish, right? It's the one thing you forgot to mention. So, a few thoughts on the future. On one symposium that dealt with Judaism and Zionism in Israel, there were several Chinese delegates, and they had a very interesting proposal. They said, what you need to do is what we did in China. You need to make clear that Judaism is a civilization. You need to transform what today are considered religious duties into civilizational values, and that becomes something that you can ultimately project also in a bigger way. And I think in many ways that charts the way forward. I think one of the most interesting and by far overlooked thinkers of Judaism and Zionism and the relationship between them is Eliezer Berkowitz. If you ever have a chance, do read a great piece from Azur, from Tchelet, that talks about the theology of Eliezer Berkowitz. And it says something fascinating. I almost carry this article with me all the time because I think it's the essence of what we're all about. He basically said, a lot of people think that Israel is important for the Jews, in the sense of refuge and protection. But is it important for Judaism? And his answer is a resounding yes. Because he says the following. He says, Judaism as a system of morality was essentially atrophied under conditions of non-sovereignty. Because when you're not sovereign, the amount of dilemmas that you deal with is very limited. There are dilemmas that have to do with family life, community life, being an endangered minority in a bigger context. But those are ultimately limited challenges. And when you create a sovereign state, you challenge yourself to deal with dilemmas on a far greater scale. And you have mentioned some of them. How do you fight a war? How do you defend yourself in a hostile environment? What is social justice? How do you integrate or not integrate those who do not share your ideals? These are far more difficult dilemmas, and they push the envelope of what Judaism is all about. And Zionism at the core was to be a revolution in Jewish life. And what happened is the Zionist revolutionaries got a bit tired. Because when they started, they were out there revolutionizing Jewish life and Jewish practices and Jewish duties. And at one point, they gave up on that. And we need to go back to that. My view, even when I said I'm a bit radical, I believe that the Knesset should be the new seat of where Jewish halacha comes from. Because what is Jewish halacha? At the core, it's Jewish law to answer the dilemmas we face as a community. So it only stands to reason that when we have gone back to a sovereign existence, we no longer need rabbinical Judaism. Rabbinical Judaism was precisely created to serve a non-sovereign people. A sovereign people creates different institutions to create law and to deal with moral dilemmas. And I think we need to begin to understand that in the Knesset, that when we make political decisions, when we make law, this is essentially the revolution of Jewish life and the revolution of Jewish law. And when we will begin to assume responsibility for that, I think we will understand that this is our responsibility in terms of Zionism. And we will also, as part of dealing with that morality, we will need to learn to deal with power. Yossi mentioned how revolutionary Zionism has been in making power natural to Jews. But we're not yet comfortable with it. What does it mean to have political power, military power? How can we deal with it morally? And I would just like to end with one message that I think needs to go out to your generation especially. I know a lot of people, especially the younger generation, are distancing themselves from Israel. They're either distancing themselves passively, by basically not wanting to have anything with it, or actively, by being some of the most effective leaders of anti-Israel campaigns. And I think what has happened is this. Outside of Israel, especially North America, Jewish identity has become a very attractive identity. It is now associated with so many positive values. It's considered progressive. And literally, Jews are loved. People want to marry Jews in unprecedented numbers. And a lot of Jews are not, this is such a new phenomenon in Jewish history that there's a desire to celebrate it and enjoy it. And who ruins it? Israel ruins it. Because this beautiful, progressive, pristine Jewish identity, Israel just messes it up. Israel is this stain on the progressive Jewish identity. And I think this is a deep misunderstanding of what it means to be Jewish. Because in moral systems that are not Jewish, in non-Jewish moral systems, you ascend in your morality by moving away from life, by not eating, by not having sex, by not having a family, by not dealing with money. The more you distance yourself from life, the more you are a moral person. The brilliance of the Jewish moral thinking is that it is in life. You will have a family. You will have sex. You will eat. You will engage in commerce and make money. But you will do all of that through a set of prescribed rules. And this is what Israel is doing for Jewish history. Israel is pushing the envelope of Jewish moral history by saying, we are now going to deal with moral dilemmas on a sovereign scale. And we're going to do it on a scale that is putting us in front of some of the most difficult challenges out there. And as soon as you put yourself in front of difficult challenges, it gets messy. When you have real dilemmas, it's never pretty. But by distancing yourself from that, you do not ascend in your morality, certainly not according to Jewish thinking. So I think it's very important to send the message that by engaging with Israel, by engaging with its dilemmas, this is the true revolution of Jewish life. This is engaging with Jewish morality, and this is engaging, according to Jewish tradition, with what it means to be in life rather than outside it. Thank you.
I think we've reached the second stage of Zionism in the sense that we have the state that we need. And it's really time to shift to imagine the society that we want. It's the stage that focuses a lot more on the content than on the structure. And it sees, and again, I think you have put this well, it sees the state as a means and not an end in itself. For me, Natan Sharansky didn't say this here, but he said it before, I like it very much. He said, you don't take the chosen people and put them in the Holy Land and ask them to be normal. And for me, I think we don't ask ourselves enough abnormal questions. If, for me, you can share this or not, if at every juncture of our decision making, we don't ask ourselves, what is it that people with our history, our values and our tradition should carry with them in answering that, we're being far too normal. You cannot look at a draft legislation in the Knesset, for instance, and not ask yourself, what does this say about me as a Jewish state if I adopt this legislation, as a Jewish people? And if you're not asking yourself that question, you are not a Jewish state. Certainly not in the sense that you should be. Now, there may be, because of a lot of difficulties and a lot of threats and a lot of dangerous reasons why the right and the moral decision and the Jewish decision is not the one you ideally aspire to. But you must ask that question. And I'm far less interested in people's actual positions on things, settlement freeze or not settlement freeze, whether there should be a limit on funding for NGOs or there shouldn't. I don't really care about the position. What I care is about whether you are bringing to that discussion values. Because when you bring values to a discussion, when you're asking yourself who we want to be in a society, you cease being the frightened, vulnerable diaspora person. You are a sovereign person. You have a sovereign mindset. And that's what we're trying to build here. We have created a sovereign state, but we have not created a sovereign state of mind. And so our challenge is to shift. I'll just very quickly say, in Shlach Lecha, Parashat Shlach Lecha, the Meraglim, the spies, they go to Israel, and 10 of them return, and one of the things they say is an incredible psychological insight. They say, Nehi be'einenu kechagavim, v'chen hayinu b'neihem. We were in our own eyes as grasshoppers, tiny as grasshoppers, and so we were in the eyes of the people we were visiting. And I think, in a way, God listened to the testimony of the 10. And he essentially said, if you see yourselves as grasshoppers, I'm going to see you as grasshoppers too. And you're not the generation that's going to build a sovereign state. We are not the biggest shtetl in the world. We are the Joshua generation. That means we are the people who get to free ourselves of that grasshopper mindset, of that mindset of asking only, what do I have to do to survive? Instead of, in addition to, the question of who do I want to be? Why do I want to survive? And that's the question I think we need to ask ourselves. And I didn't know Avi myself, but from the video that I saw and from the questions he asked himself, I really thought that there was an example that he was setting there, which is fitting for us to take away from today. Thank you.
So to take Tal's challenge into an explicitly religious sphere, what is the sovereign face of Torah in our time? What does it mean when we say Ki mitzion tetzei Torah? What is the nature of Torah? What is the message of Torah? And first of all, I think that the most interesting argument in the coming 50 years, is that the time frame we're talking about, will not be the old secular religious divide. I think that belongs to an earlier, less formed period of our national development. The far more interesting and important argument is going to be within the general camp of religious Jews, and I define religious Jews in a very broad sense. To think about the future of Judaism, not only here, but around the world, the term that most resonates for me is Jewish renewal. There are efforts, as many of you know, in the United States to create Jewish renewal, and some of them are very interesting. I feel that the most potent form of Jewish renewal in the long term is going to happen here. And the reason for that is very simple, because the conditions of sovereignty make it possible for us to create new forms of Judaism without self-consciousness, without the self-consciousness of a minority status. To think about what the face of Jewish renewal might look like, I don't have an answer for that at this point, but I'm beginning to hear the soundtrack, literally, the soundtrack of the future Israeli Judaism, and it is what's being played on the radio over the last few years here, and that is the increasing spiritualization in general terms, and in some cases specifically Jewish spiritualization of Israeli popular music. This is an extraordinary development, which, like so many other extraordinary developments in Israel, we learn to take for granted too quickly. And what has happened is that Israeli rock music, which was once the carrier of the ethos of a new secular Israeli culture, largely divorced from Judaism, is now becoming one of the main means for the re-Judaization of Israeli culture. Now, the last point that I'd like to raise, and here I'll speak very specifically as a religious person, as a religious Jew, and that is the need to reclaim a spiritual Zionist narrative. And a religious person asks the question, why does something happen? What is God's plan? And so that's the starting point that I ask in terms of understanding our return here. Why did we return specifically when we did? We returned at the dawn of the nuclear era. We returned just as humanity was making the evolutionary leap into an unprecedented situation where we are now the first generation in the history of humanity that can't take human continuity for granted. Which is another way of saying, Elie Wiesel has said this in the past, that the whole world has now become Jewish. And in a sense, the world is facing the kind of situation that we faced in 1945, which is we have two choices. That is to transcend our mundane reality or to perish. The old survival as business as usual was untenable for the Jewish people in 1945. The Haredim opted for survival as usual. Most of the Jewish people became Zionized. And what that meant in 1945 was that in order to meet the challenge of survival, we need to transcend our existence. And what we did was actualize the great Jewish fantasy of return to Zion and the ingathering of the exiles. So, in that sense, I think that our return here, at this apocalyptic moment for humanity, has a deep significance in terms of, first of all, imparting hope to humanity, and secondly, as creating a kind of precedent where the choice is transcend or perish, and the Jewish people chose to transcend. And that is, for me at least, that's one reason why I'm here. And the last point that I'll make, and this is really in response to Tal, and Tal, I resonate with much of what you say, but I think that you'll resonate with what I'm going to say, which is the realization, and it doesn't happen that often, but every so often, there's the realization that my mundane daily life, being stuck in a traffic jam outside the walls of the old city on my way from home in French Hill to my office in the German colony, is in fact the realization of the wildest fantasies of the past.